we want to turn to Latin America, to Colombia, to, what could be a very momentous election coming up here. I believe on the 29th is the actual day itself, this upcoming weekend. And we are very honored to be joined for this conversation by our good friend, Zoe Alexandra, who's a journalist, co-editor of People's Dispatch, very relevant for this, lived and worked and continues to cover Colombia very closely. So the person we need to be talking to. Zoe, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, maybe give us a sense of what the stakes are here in the Colombian elections. I think, some people are following it. It's maybe probably the most coverage in America Colombian elections gotten in a while, but I don't think people are hearing a lot about why this is so historic potentially. So maybe just set the scene for us a bit.
Definitely. I think it's super important to do this kind of historic recounting of what these elections really mean. It's not just another electoral process. We really have to look at the moment in history, the moment in time that these are taking place, the trajectory of Colombian politics up until now. And so with that being said, these are, of course, historic. This is the first time in 60 years and in many, many decades that a progressive ticket has an actual chance of winning Colombian elections. Colombia was one of the countries where elites very early on saw that it was important, whether they were conservative, whether they were liberal, they had to make a pact, and they made a pact. It was called the National Pact. So it was made in the 60s to basically bar any sort of people-centered, people-focused, working class possibility from arriving to office. This national pact that was made between conservative and liberal elites was made after 10 years of the violence, the uprising that happened following the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, where the liberals and conservatives were fighting each other. And in order to stop, the actual working class aspirations from making its way to the halls of power in Colombia, they created this pact. And of course, the pact didn't last until today. But in some senses, it really has, because the country, unlike many of its neighbors, unlike many in the region, has never been ruled by any sort of progressive government. It has been ruled by governments that have favored the U.S. interest in the region. It is home to 7 U.S. military bases. It has some of the most lenient laws regarding mineral extraction, oil extraction, very unfavorable policies for its large peasant population, a country with extremely lenient labor laws where workers have essentially no rights, a privatized healthcare system, privatized higher education. And this is precisely due to this dominance of neoliberal conservative politics in Colombia. So that being said, the fact that the ticket of the Historic Pact, and it's called Historic Pact because it really is historic, it's bringing together progressive forces from across the spectrum, from traditional left forces in the country, new social movements, some disgruntled members of the Liberal Party, of more liberal sections of Colombia's politics, and they're coming together in the Historic Pact that's led by Gustavo Petro, who I think we're seeing right now on the screen, and Francia Marquez. These two are extremely emblematic of this Historic Pact. Gustavo Petro, a former member of the M19 guerrilla, has had experience in electoral politics since he demobilized from the group. Since the group demobilized, he was mayor of Bogota. He oversaw an administration that saw great advances in social policies in the city, where there were a lot of education programs, a lot of work employment programs, policies that really can see how that would transform into a national level. Francia Marquez is a land defender, human rights defender, comes from the Afro-Colombian movement. She works very closely with peasant movements, urban movements, women's movements. She really represents these sectors that have been coming out onto the streets for the past decade, demanding social changes, demanding structural changes, saying no to the violence, saying no to the armed conflict. The image we're seeing now on the screen is of a campaign rally on Saturday when Francia Marquez was pointed at with a laser, direct threat to her life. Bodyguards had to cover up her with shields. This speaks to the gravity of what this Historic Pact ticket represents, all of the aspirations of the working people in Colombia finally trying to break through and emerged from these decades of conservative policy, of anti-people policies that have submerged Colombia into a country where there's high levels of unemployment, one of the countries with the highest number of massacres, human rights defenders being assassinated. So that's kind of the general picture.
So with all that said, obviously the elites are not going to let this happen easily, right? So in the lead up to this election, you mentioned some death threats against one of the candidates. What are the ways that these people are being pushed back against by that sort of like entrenched, powerful right-wing elite that has been in charge of the country since its inception?
For sure. I mean, on one hand, we see the direct death threats from actual active paramilitary organizations in the country. So these are not death threats that are coming, just from online anonymous Twitter bots. These are death threats that are coming from paramilitary groups that are active in the territories of Colombia, that are linked to drug trafficking groups. Gustavo Petro had to suspend his campaign activities for a couple of days following one of these death threats that came from one of these groups. Francia Marquez has been targeted really through her whole life as an activist by some of these groups. These have, of course, increased exponentially since she was selected to be the vice presidential candidate. We saw this direct threat to her life that happened on Saturday, but there have been many communiques been released by, for example, one of the groups Águilas Negras, the Black Eagles. They have been threatening her. Most recently, in this past week, there's been a very intensified fake news campaign against Francia, against Gustavo Petro. One of the sort of ridiculous cases of this is that a woman pretending to be Francia's daughter said that Francia's politics about Afro-Colombians and the need to have representational politics for this community that has been so marginalized, so oppressed through Colombia's history is false, and that she's being a victim, saying all of these things against Francia and her candidacy. Turns out Francia comes out with a statement. She doesn't have any daughters. She has 2 sons. And this video is going viral in Colombia, slanderizing Francia, and it's completely fictitious. So all of these types of multi-pronged campaign. And then, of course, you have right-wing politicians saying that Gustavo Petro and Francia are Castro Chavista, that they want to make Colombia Venezuela. And many people have said, what could be worse? What could happen that's worse than what's already happening in Colombia? What can get worse than the fact that over 1,200 human rights defenders and social leaders have been assassinated since the peace agreements were signed? What could be worse that children are dying from hunger, are dying because of poverty? They're being evicted from their homes. They're being forced to displace themselves because of paramilitary violence. What could be worse than this? So this comparison saying that they're going to plunge the country into chaos, it's already in chaos. There's already violence. What could really, and so it's this horrible politics of fear that the Colombian right uses time after time. They did this during the peace agreements. They're continuing to do it today. And it's just horrible because they don't care about the lives of the people. They don't want policies that are going to promote the inclusion of all of the marginalized groups in society. They don't want to give people education. They don't want to give them access to healthcare. So it's really relying on this negative rhetoric, criticizing the opposition, saying that they're horrible people. And at the end of the day, it's just so they can maintain control of their land, control of their resources, and control of their, interests in the region.
I think some of this may have been implied, but I did want to ask directly, Zoe, about the program of the Historic Pact and some of the things that they're planning on bringing in, because it has inspired, it is historic, I think, a politics of hope that is really rising in a major way. So what are some of the things that they have proposed they would do if they're able to come in to power in Colombia?
So there's a variety of things. I think some of the key elements have to do with respecting some of the previous agreements and previous accords that have been made with different groups in the country. For example, in the peace agreements, there's very clear policies laid out that have been not respected by the current government of Iván Duque, programs that have been underfunded, land reform programs, programs of the transition for these fighters. So there's an element of respecting what the state has already agreed to. For example, fracking, which has really been a big debate in the country, banning these sorts of really destructive environmental policies that have destroyed the environment in Colombia. As I mentioned, Colombia has very rich resource wealth, which transnational corporations have basically pillaged for their own benefit. And so one of the key pillars is transitioning away from this destructive policies of just taking all these resources out of the country, giving them to foreign companies, looking towards developing the agricultural sector, ensuring access to education. There is accessible public education in the country, but it's very prohibitive to enter because a lot of these universities are test-based. When Álvaro Uribe Vélez was president, not only did he oversee a campaign of sort of extermination of the left, but he also privatized the healthcare in the country. And so I think the guarantee of these basic rights, the slogan of Francia Marquez is Vivir Sabroso, which means live richly, live with dignity, live with joy, live with hope, and meeting the needs of these marginalized populations, trying to rectify the historic wrongs against Colombia's people through decades of armed conflict and the counterinsurgency policies that have been supported by the US government, the war on drugs, which has seen the destruction of people's livelihoods. And so really it's making right with all of these wrongs.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe,
well, I just wanted to ask real quick, for those of us who want to follow along on Sunday as these elections are taking place, I know there's going to be lots of people on the ground kind of like giving updates and providing monitoring in case there's any attempts to, try to make sure that certain people don't get to vote. So where should people follow along so that they can see what's happening in Colombia?
Well, there's going to be a lot of different, for Spanish media, there's a lot of different journalists on the ground. We at People's Dispatch will definitely be providing updates. It's important to mention, there were a couple electoral observers that were actually banned from the country, that were detained and deported. Terry Matson of Code Pink, several other electoral observers from Latin America. So this is a key important point as well. But I would follow along at People's Dispatch. I know that Colombia Informa from Colombia is a really great source. Causasha News, I know they're going to be following closely. And there's numerous of other media organizations in Colombia that people can check out. And definitely important to stay tuned, stay alert, and support the Colombians people, restoration of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, as always, I appreciate it. Very, very comprehensive. And I think, certainly this is going to be very interesting to see on Sunday. And hopefully we'll be able to bring you back and talk about positive things and a momentous change in Colombia. But yes, follow People's Dispatch. Couldn't recommend it more highly. Zoe Alexandra is the co-editor. Thank you so much for giving us a piece of some of your time. Ooh.
No problem. Always great to be with you guys.
Thank you.